This video is on simplifying radicals with negatives. So for example, the square root of -9. But before we simplify radicals with negatives, let's take a look at a radical that has no negatives. For example, radical 8. I can't take the square root of 8, so I have to break it down into two pieces, the square root of 4 and the square root of 2. This becomes 2 radical 2. So just as I split the square root of 8, I can break down the square root of -9 into two pieces. I can make it into the square root of 9 and the square root of -1. You know that the square root of 9 is 3, and by definition, the square root of -1 is going to equal I. So that's important to remember. So that means that I have 3 times I, which is 3I. So when you have a perfect square under the radical, you don't need to break it down. For example, if I give you something like the square root of -25, we know that the square root of 25 is 5, and now I know that as long as I have a negative under the radical, we'll get 5I. What if I gave you something that didn't have a square root and I couldn't break down? For example, the square root of -3. I can't break down the square root of -3, and I can't take the square root of -3. So I have to leave it. But I can take out that negative and make it an I. So the square root of -3 is just I radical 3. Let's take a look at an example here. So just like before, I'm going to split this radical into two pieces. And I'm going to keep this 5 over here on the outside. So I'm looking for a perfect square that goes in evenly. Remember, your perfect squares are 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and they continue. So I want two numbers that multiply to 18, one of which is a perfect square. So I'm going to use 9 and 2. And because it was a -18, I'm going to make that 9 a negative. We know that the square root of -9 is 3I. I'm going to keep that radical 2, and I'm also going to bring down that 5. So my last step is just 5 times 3I, which gives me 15I radical 2. And let's take a look at one more now where we have to add. You should remember from adding radicals that you must have the same radicals in order to add them. Because I don't have the same number under the radical, I need to split them up. So the square root of -50 is going to be -25 and 2. The square root of -25 is 5I, and I'm keeping that radical 2. Now if I do the same thing with radical -32, this is going to become -16 and 2. So I'm adding this, and it's going to be 4I radical 2. And now that I have both radicals the same, they both have a radical 2, I can add my like terms, my coefficients. So 5I plus 4I gives us 9I radical 2. And that's how we simplify square roots with negatives.